The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hi, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm speaking with Dr. Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute. And Andrew, we had a really great conversation just before the holidays about DEI. And you said in very strong language, I really just loved that you're calling this out. You have you've written an article where you've outlined some of the main problems with DEI trainings and culture and ideology. And I love the way you're kind of breaking it down for us. You called it out, social justice is a hate movement. DEI is aggressive and immoral and hateful and destructive. And I love that you're just coming right out, speaking really plainly about this. Last time we talked about the first two sort of bullet points in your analysis of what this is. And it was the all or nothing framing, as well as the aggression that's inherent in this DEI.
Yeah.
You spoke about virtue signaling and why that's a misnomer and a number of other issues. And I wanted to hear more so we could go into kind of a part two and get into some of the details a little bit more.
Yes. Let's just let's talk I think there were some things from our last conversation that weren't fully unpacked, and I just want to kind of hit a couple of those at the start. I mean, the first thing, and one of the reasons why I think these conversations are really important is my psychoanalytic senses really are very activated by our national conversations about race and other identity politics issues. I see a lot of the red herrings that you see in therapy that imply defense mechanisms, really dysfunctional, distorted thinking patterns. Like, you see a lot of these things that really trigger something's off here, and there's something dynamic happening that's keeping people from being um, mature and more accurate and well regulated in these conversations. And one of the biggest red herrings that our conversation on these topics is dysfunctional is the fact that it's considered a third rail to talk directly about anti-white aggression. The idea that we are afraid to talk about that as something that would be wrong and warrant attention, that is a big signal that the conversation is really, really dysfunctional. Like, what moral basis can it be that racial aggression directed at a group is a forbidden topic? Doesn't make sense. And so the idea that we're not capable of talking about it without things going totally haywire is an indicator that the conversation is really, really distorted in a severe way. And people are really um, not thinking clearly about these issues. And I think there's reasons to think that there's fairly severe defense mechanisms at play. The most obvious one is what we talked about, the all or nothing thinking, that's splitting.
Mhm.
And that really is I think the most dominant defense mechanism that's active when we talk about race and other identity politics issues. The implicit rules of discourse are that there are certain groups that you can attack viciously. You can call them sinful, toxic, immoral, privileged oppressors who need to be dismantled. You can say very aggressive things towards certain demographic groups, but you can't compliment or defend them. You can't express empathy towards them or concern for them. You can't confront hatred or bias against them, and you can't talk about strengths against that they have, positive cultural trends or dynamics in their history or culture. You can't talk about that. So there's this certain groups are these all bad categories that can be insulted but not defended or complimented. And other groups are these all good categories that have to be praised and celebrated, but you can't talk about any negative trends or dynamics in their culture unless you attribute it entirely to white people or entirely to men. And so that it's not just that they only say good things about one group and only say bad things about the other. It's that anything that deviates from that is intolerable and it gets repressed. So if somebody were to say something positive, a positive trend or dynamic about white people, or talk about anti-white aggression as a legitimate issue, that would that would be emotionally intolerable. It would literally sound immoral, false, unreasonable, unacceptable to them, and they would have to find a way to reject it. They have to reject all of that information from consciousness. So anything positive about the disfavored groups or negative about the favored groups is totally rejected. Okay. Now, another way of putting it is all that information is repressed. Okay, so we can really think about this dynamically as there's all of this repressed content.
Mm.
And this is stuff that is emotions, but it's also thoughts, questions, observations, self-states, desires, lot memories. It's anything that doesn't fit in that framework gets repressed and it's intolerable. Now, what that means is that when we start to overcome this defense of splitting and start to talk about groups in a more balanced way, the just to the floodgates open, and there's an enormous amount of repressed thoughts, feelings, and experiences, memories, perceptions, all that stuff floods,
Mm.
and it can be very psychologically destabilizing. It's very hard to process it, reflect on it, make sense of it, and integrate it into a balanced and coherent worldview. That's one of the reasons why it's so threatening and why it's so difficult for people to tolerate. And people really very clearly have like meltdowns when they encounter this information. That, hey, guess what? There's positive and negative trends in every group, and here's what that looks like. They can't tolerate that basic reality, that obvious reality.
Mm.
Okay. And so they break down. And I'm talking tears, fighting, like total breakdown. Um, Now, because this really severe defense mechanism is so active, it feeds into um, other defense mechanisms that kind of work in conjunction with it. And I think the one that we talked about that I just wanted to touch on a little bit more is reaction formation.
Mhm.
Now, reaction formation is when you take a feeling and you turn it into the opposite. And I think we gave a couple of examples, but just to refresh people's memory, a classic is you imagine like a woman has a crush on a guy, he's unavailable for some reason, so she hates the guy. She hates him. And she is constantly talking about him and how obnoxious he is, and she's picking fights with him that actually just make them more enmeshed. And it's that kind of that's an example of reaction formation. Another very famous one is like the anti-gay crusader who is obsessed with gay pornography and how disgusting it is and has like repressed homosexual desires. That's another example. But you can think of lots of examples like this. Like I remember when I was learning about it in grad school, like there was an example of like the stepdad's feelings towards his redheaded stepson,
Mm.
who he like can't stand, but so he like loves him so much. And he just like
Mm.
wants to like, but the love is like very misattuned and intrusive and aggressive. And it's because he can't tolerate his hatred. So he turns it in. So it's anytime you turn a feeling into its opposite.
Mm.
And what you see here is our discourse about identity politics issues is so severely distorted into this all or nothing framing that there's lots of intolerable thoughts and feelings, and they end up getting turned into their opposite in a weird way. So there are a couple telltale signs that reaction formation is at play. In those examples, the woman with a crush, the stepson, the gay, anti-gay crusader or whatever. There's a couple telltale signs. One of them is It's weird.
Hmm.
It doesn't really fit. Okay. Another is it's counterproductive. Okay. It accomplishes the opposite of the stated goal. Okay. And the third is you can kind of, it has overtones of the true feeling underneath it. So
Mm.
you can kind of detect it. And you see all of this stuff with race. The white people who are they hate white people so much and they think black people are so great. And they'll say things like black people can't get a photo ID and math is racist because black people can't do math. And like just the most racist shit you can possibly imagine. That's like no, it's Hitlerian racism. Like it's the most demeaning stuff to black people. And this is what the most anti-white pro-black people, and they say things that are so incredibly condescending, like theft, having theft be a crime is racist because black people can't not steal. Or it's unbelievable how it's like the most racist stuff you've ever heard. And it has a weird tone to it. It's odd, it's bizarre, frankly, a lot of it. It's kind of people struggle to explain what's even animating these people because their motives are weird, their tone is weird. You can tell there's something odd about these people and how they're thinking about these issues, and it's very distorted. And then you can also see how what they do is so immensely counterproductive. It turns people away from multiculturalism. It turns people away from fighting racism. It pushes people into the alt-right. It pushes people towards white supremacy. It sabotages black communities by let's get all the cops out of black neighborhoods. It's like stuff that's just like, are you trying to destroy these communities? That's what it does do. Like it
Mhm.
is. So it's like it has all the hallmarks of reaction formation. And that's just one example. I think there's lots of defense mechanisms that end up getting activated when there are thoughts and feelings that are intolerable for people. And on race, it's clear that there's lots of true important information that we can't tolerate talking about in a mature way, so it gets repressed and you get to see and it's an unusually good way to see psychoanalytic defense mechanisms in mass in society. Like I don't think we always get such great opportunities to see these defense mechanisms happen on such a large scale. They happen in individual psychotherapy sessions where but it's an unusually good space to see these and we really do need psychoanalysis to explain this because it is about why are people incapable of tolerating all of this important true information, and why are they then engaging in these really bizarre ways of behaving, like and framing issues? And psychoanalysis provides a way to explain all of that, I think, really elegantly and with concepts that have been around for 100 years. So I just wanted to hit that, and I think it's really important to have theories like this because otherwise, I think the default way of looking at the white people who make these claims, and by the way, I don't think anti-white hate is just coming from white people. I think there's lots of anti-white hate coming from every racial group in the world. But there is clearly some, and in the West, it's being led by white people in part. And we do need a theory of what's animating them because they are some of the most viciously aggressive people in our society, and they are hurting so many people and they're causing so much dysfunction. You do need a good formulation of what are they doing and why. And I think splitting and reaction formation are absolutely essential to describe and understand their behavior. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to kind of like put a flag in that and really highlight that for people before we move on to other problems with DEI.
Well, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking Robin DiAngelo comes to mind, and the way that she pushes this idea about all white people being racist. But if you look at how she backs up her proposals, it's clear that she's really talking about herself. And so, there's this like, that sounds like that's a you problem. Like you're really overreacting to something that you're repressing or you're feeling guilt about or you're feeling troubled by in yourself. And so I'm wondering for if you use the reaction formation hypothesis and the splitting, where do you think this comes from in the people that are pushing this? Why are
Yeah,
they
yeah.
developing this?
Yeah, I want to be careful for me, and you don't
Mm,
have to feel, but I cannot diagnose a public figure, and I want to be
yeah.
really not to do that personally. It's fine to share your observations about that. I think this is a broad cultural trend, and I
Hmm.
think that we could do studies to gather data on this at some point. I
Yeah.
hope we actually do.
Well, the reason I
But
brought up that
it's
particular
important.
name
Yeah.
is
Yes.
just that we had to read her stuff for my
Yes.
program, and
Yes.
it was chock full of this kind of like, wait a minute, this, when you say that there's like a distortion there, I'm not talking about diagnosing her as a person.
Yeah.
I'm diagnosing her work and the things that she's putting out there. She's the clear distortion, like something isn't right here about what
Some
you're doing and how you're packaging this. It doesn't jive.
And yeah, and you see weirder stuff if you really go into the literature of like white people writing about whiteness as this
Hmm.
awful thing. Really, like it's worth doing a textual analysis of these. A lot of people talk about how addictive whiteness is, that it's like a
Oh,
drug.
interesting.
It gets you high and it feels so good and it's
Wow.
irresistible, but you can't do it because it's wrong. And there's just things that they that
That's
are just like
bizarre.
it's so reaction formation.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
like, it's just like it just has that ring to
Mm,
it. It hits all of the notes. Um, but yeah, I think that this is the issue. Splitting, we've
mhm,
broadly adopted. I think we've slid it in for complex reasons. We've slipped into cultural norms where you have to only say bad things about certain demographic categories and only good things about others. And when you're put in that situation, it it really pushes people into reaction formation. If you
mm,
can't have an accurate, healthy, positive view of yourself and of the world, you're going to develop these really dysfunctional patterns, and reaction formation is one.
mhm,
And so I think it's ironic because it's like the fact that we can't say anything positive about white people, that we can't address anti-white hate, that actually sets the framework for reaction formation to be necessary for them.
mm,
And I think, ironically, if they could have a healthier, more balanced view of themselves, there wouldn't be the need for these kinds of bizarre, primitive distortions
mm,
that I think they really engage in. So I think it's secondary to the splitting. I think the splitting pushes and there's other defense mechanisms at play too. Like there can be paranoia, like white people are portrayed as this kind of omnipotent, malignant other that somehow engineers every problem in the world. There's a lot of really distorted thinking that's out there.
mhm,
And I don't want to say everybody who supports social justice has exactly this paradigm in any like splitting is very culturally normative. It's very rare to encounter somebody who would say something positive about white people, like a positive trend or dynamic about white people. Like that is very unacceptable in our culture. And it's actually unacceptable to even say that racial hatred of white people is wrong.
mm,
That's like, which is outrageous, which is a really indication of just how severe the splitting is.
mm,
But it's those realities really push people to develop the reaction formation. And it's almost like the more abused they get for being white, but they can't stand up for themselves. So all of that pain and unfair insults and mistreatment and demonization is actually like fodder for more reaction formation.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Is it something that can be communicated or taught to other people? So are these actual defense mechanisms transmitted through the education, or are we talking about the people who are sort of the main architects and promoters of this, but there's a different process going on with people in the sort of the educated, indoctrinated group?
I think that the trainings, the DEI trainings really do foster these
Hmm.
processes.
Hmm.
Obviously not everybody who completes the training develops these patterns, but I think that they really do a lot to
Hmm.
cultivate them.
Okay.
Um, and we, and I think that if we can get to a culture where we're able, like, I see this, even think about historical trends where it's like, if you're talking about like the colonial period of the United States and like how the Native Americans have to be these like pure, innocent, honorable people who are living in one in nature peacefully and are simply trying to protect their way of life from the really malicious, evil white people who are killing them deliberately and rejecting every prospect of peace. Like there are so many things. Like our history is really distorted
Hmm.
because we can't accurately describe what happened. Our current politics are distorted because we can't talk about what's actually happening. There's so many ways that this is really dominant. And I think until we can get to a place where we can talk about issues in a real way, positive and negative in every group, trends and dynamics in every group. We have to get comfortable actually saying that stuff and talking through it in a balanced, accurate way. Until we're there, I think it's going to be ripe for every manner of defense mechanism to be triggered by this process.
Well, how do you think we'll know when we're there at the point where we can talk about it? Because is this sort of a pendulum swing from a place where we did have more racism going towards minorities, and now the pendulum has just swung so that we're refocusing what you talked about, the idea of justice as vengeance. So are we
Yeah.
in this vengeful swing, and do you anticipate that we'll settle down into a place where we can actually have more robust and nuanced conversations about these things in an educational setting?
If we can do it through dialogue, it can the swings don't have to be as drastic.
Mhm.
If we can't talk about it, it's going to be ripe for enactments
Mhm.
that where the swings can actually intensify.
Mhm.
Because there's just nobody's understanding what the other side is doing and why, and everybody's engaging in these like primitive defenses, and it can really spiral. So if we can do it through dialogue, there's the ability to slow it down. But the amount of repressed thoughts and feelings, I think, is really immense. And I think people are probably not even, most people aren't even aware of how much they've repressed. And it's stuff that's like really emotionally powerful. So it's going to be hard for people to start to let themselves feel that stuff, notice that stuff, talk about that stuff. Um, I think that's going to be a challenge. It's going to take time. I don't think we're anywhere near it. We're not even at a place where you can say racially motivated aggression at white people is wrong. I
Mhm.
mean, that is really unhealthy. It's a big problem, and it's a red herring. That's the clearest signal that like this is a we have a really dysfunctional, we are not capable of mature conversations about race. That's
Mhm.
what it means. And until we actually have a society where we can say, look, to the extent we're going to talk about these racial categories, we can think about positive and negative dynamics in all of them. It doesn't make sense to only praise and celebrate some and then only attack others. Like that's not going to work. We need to say hatred against all is wrong, bias against all is wrong. We need to be able to talk about those things and document them and respond to them in a constructive way. We need to be able to talk about positive and negative dynamics and all. I mean, I would actually sit down and think like, can can we name a few positive and negative dynamics in different groups and actually talk about that? I mean, we're so far from that. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just unimaginable to me that we could do that in mainstream civil society. Um, so, and I think people are afraid of going there. I mean, they're afraid of what's going to happen if the floodgates actually get opened up.
Well, I think all of the dialogue around race, it's essentially applied demography that misses the central truth that there's more difference there's more variation within groups than between groups. We're talking about individual expression of different characteristics. And you're always going to find that different groups have individuals that are, demographically categorized within a group, but have such a wide range of individual variability that's the central harm of racial profiling and racism.
Absolutely. It's also like, and you know, this is maybe like a negative note because I think you're absolutely right. Um, it's so hard for me to see um, groups focused on racial activism for all the different groups that exist just deciding to fold and go away.
Mm,
And
mm,
the different studies departments and the different nonprofits and advocacy groups, and it's billions and billions of dollars, and it's millions of people, and it's not going away. I think we really had it. It's very sad because I think we really had the possibility of truly creating a colorblind society that was not focused on identity politics. And what we did over the last decade in particular, but really the past half century, was we blew up that possibility. And
mhm,
I'm not to say it's never possible, but it's so hard to imagine getting to a place where we fully are there. I think I would rather we be in a place that's really is that kind of like colorblind meritocracy society, but I think the next best thing is the capacity to tolerate ambivalence and have a dialectical conversation about these issues where we can talk about good and bad in each group. That's a small consolation prize. It's not the way that I would have wanted it to go, but
mhm,
I don't I don't see getting to that, getting back there within my lifetime. I
mhm,
mean,
mhm.
history does weird things. Maybe we'll be surprised, but
Yeah, well, it's a good thing to put an emphasis on this process, and I think it's really interesting the psychoanalytic lens that you're bringing to this.
and it's so important to, it's just like with a patient where you have to kind of say the intervention like a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen times before it sinks in. People have to hear this over and over again, and then they start to feel it.
Mm,
At some point it penetrates, and they start to think, oh, I've been repressing this, or oh, this other thing that, I mean, like for me, I'll just like disclose, like I think for most of my life, talking about anti-white aggression would have sounded racist to me.
really.
Yeah, because that's what I was conditioned to think,
Mm,
you know? And it's clearly not, but I think there's
mhm,
all kinds of things we've internalized like that that keep us
mm,
from accurately understanding the world and ourselves. And so there's a lot more to happen. I understand that it's like, yeah, maybe DEI programs are in retreat right now, which is at least superficially true. But for the culture to really thoroughly be righted here, there's a lot of work. And I actually
mhm,
think mental health professionals can play a really central role in highlighting these issues and helping people process repressed feelings and talk through them in a constructive, mature, pro-social, kind of positive way.
mm.
They need our help. They're not doing it, and they need guidance, I think, to do this. And I think if we can use our skills, we could help that happen.
Well, I was curious when you were talking about repression about concrete examples, and now that you brought that up, you shared that sort of evolution of your own thought or the change in your own perspective. It does remind me. So, as a person who I was a white minority as a kid growing up
Yeah.
in a multi or mostly Hispanic area, really, and got bullied quite a bit for it. I never had any, I mean, my first kind of kindergarten was an introduction to anti-white racism. It was blatant and obvious all the way through my school and social experience that
Right, right.
this was an open thing that we don't like white people. Um, when I got to graduate school, this was the first time where I really started to I guess I'd gotten away from it for a while during my adulthood, my early adulthood to middle adulthood. I was just not around a lot of that sentiment.
Right.
And coming back to this graduate setting and in all places, a psychology program, having this talked about in this kind of simplified, reductive way that DEI shares this information and these ideas, and watching all the people agree with it, all the, white people just nodding along and talking about their privilege. This was really shocking to me. And so there is, I guess as you're sharing that, I'm thinking, yeah, there's a cohort of adult white Americans who are repressing a lot of this
Yes.
feeling of nuance. They're not allowing themselves to experience the discomfort that this must bring to, I'm in this category. And so is my mother and my father and my son and my daughter. I mean, I'm putting us all down when I
Yes.
use this kind of language to talk about privilege and dismiss my own worth.
Yeah. And like this is also really relevant in thinking about the self-censorship, the
Mhm.
censorship conversation, because censorship cultures don't just lead to self-censorship, they lead to repression.
Mhm.
People repress thoughts and feelings that are too scary to say.
Mhm.
But most people don't. It's actually like, it's a good sign if you can recognize, like, this is really hurtful and frustrating and scary, and I'm not sure what I can say about it, but I recognize those things.
Mhm.
That's a sign of maturity. A lot of those people don't have the psychological maturity to even be there. They're just repressing all of that because it's too scary for them to even think about
Mhm.
noticing that. And I think there's probably more repression than self-censorship.
Mhm.
Like by the time you're at self-censorship, you're actually like, that's pretty good. That's an achievement, really.
Because
Like
at least you're not lying to yourself.
you're not, yeah, it's not even, it's happening at an unconscious, they're not, you're not aware when you're engaging in defense mechanisms. You're
Uh-huh.
just repressing information that's
Yeah.
too scary. Like, but it's like, of course, that's ripe for repression. They're thoughts and feelings that can get you fired for saying,
Yeah.
that can ruin your life if you feel them or think them. That's exactly the type of stuff that people are going to repress.
Mhm.
So it's like, and I think it's why so much of our moment can't really be understood well without referencing psychoanalytic concepts like
Mhm.
defense mechanisms, because we talk a lot about borderline dynamics. Those are secondary to these primitive defenses too.
Mhm.
It's like all fueled by the fact that people are repressing so many thoughts and feelings because, and self-states, memories, all of this stuff, because and of course they're repressing them. They're scary as shit to think about saying. You're going to get fired. You're going to get kicked out of your program. You're going to get this, that, or like, people don't want to think that stuff.
Mhm.
So at an unconscious level, they get this signal anxiety that that's a forbidden thing, and they're just like, nope, not thinking.
Mhm.
And they don't even, then they're not even aware of
Mhm.
what's in there. It doesn't mean it's not affecting them.
Mhm.
Those repressed emotions can do a lot of work,
Mhm.
but they're not conscious. Um,
There was
but
I'll just to give an example, and I wonder what you would think about this. There was a woman in my program. She was a really lovely person. Just I liked her a lot. I thought she was really intelligent and kind and just a nice person. She had a good relationship with her husband and she loved her little boy. She had a little son, and they're all Caucasian white people. And she would openly disparage cishet white men. That was a phrase that I heard from her. She was the first person I ever heard say that. And she would just say it to put people down. It was like, oh, the cishet white men. And I would think, well, but you're married to a white man and you have a white little boy. Like how is this working in your mind that this is the most demonized group for you, the group that is the
oh
worst,
yeah.
and yet these are the closest people to you in your world?
Well, and um, my experience is that,
Mhm.
like, I mispronouncing, like, the same people who would get so upset about you mispronouncing their name they have a name from a language you've never heard of and
Mhm.
you mispronounce it, and that's racist, and they'll go ballistic. And those same people will just say up front, I think white people are total shit.
Mhm.
And with no shame and no apology, and actually feel proud of themselves and feel like they're the voice of justice and enlightenment and heroism for saying such repulsively hateful and ignorant things. So they often go hand in hand. I it's yeah, it's really shocking. And it's why, like, just think like we can use our common sense. Like, how would you feel as the husband of a woman who said that about you? You'd probably feel like degraded, humiliated, angry, worthless, bitter, like all those things. Well, can't tolerate that, so they get repressed and then they get turned into I love you or something.
Mhm.
And it's like it's really it ends up being very twisted, very, very twisted. But it's why people really need to have the ability to have a positive but constructive view of themselves and the ability to talk. Like, you have to have that, or you
Mhm.
actually set yourself up for those experiences.
That's what I was wondering. I was wondering what are the vulnerabilities that make people more susceptible to these kinds of thought patterns? Is it about something in early childhood? Is it about an identity formation process? What is it that would leave someone either make somebody more resilient or leave someone more vulnerable?
Well, I'm actually, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking one other, I'll say this first, is like another defense mechanism here that's like obviously very active is moralization.
Okay.
And the way that like really extreme but like off kilter moralizing is a way of repressing your own thoughts and feelings.
Mhm.
You know, there's a lot of weird dynamics here. And I think people are clearly struggling to understand what's animating these people. And they have an
Mhm.
outsized cultural influence. They run institutions
Mhm.
like universities that are super important. And so there's a real need to have an understanding of it. Maybe we're framing it the wrong way. We have an incredibly powerful media and social media system and education system that are all pushing people into all or nothing thinking and reaction formation and moralization and these other defense mechanisms. The people who are unique are the people who seem to be not falling into that and having the ability to say, I don't deserve this. And this
Mhm.
is distorted. It takes a lot of like trust of your own conscience, of your own insights it takes a lot of to be able to recognize these problems as being wrong and say that they're wrong and speak up about them in a constructive way. That seems to be the thing that's not happening.
Mhm.
So maybe it's more the other way around. What is it that enables people to do it? One thing that probably is important is having had the experience of talking with other people about these issues,
Mhm.
place that was safe. And maybe that happens in your family or with your friend group, and maybe it happens with a therapist. But the ability to talk through this stuff is really, really important somewhere. If you're totally alone and this is what your
Mhm.
parents and siblings think and everybody in your social circle thinks, and you've been taught your whole life you have to think this way or you're a bad person, I think it's going to be much harder to overcome.
That being able to sort of test your thoughts out loud with another person, that sort of reality checking plus perspective taking, validation, just working through the thoughts, and even like just this conversation we're having right now, where you
Yes.
kind of goes all over the place, but you're working through something.
Yes. And the ability to and I think it's like also modeling. It's the ability to see one other person. Not like because the another defense mechanism too is just to go to the opposite. And to be like, fine, I'm evil or
Mhm.
whatever, I'll show you evil. Or there's different things you can do, but you can go in the other direction. And that can be counterproductive too.
Mhm.
Or it usually is.
Mhm.
So So the ability to see somebody talking about these issues in a non-hateful but assertive, constructive way, but one that's not doesn't fall into these traps of all or nothing framing, of reaction formation and stuff. That can be really powerful. I think people need modeling, they need spaces to talk through these things, they need supports. It's a lot to overcome the immensity of the indoctrination. I mean, like your entire education system through your graduate degree and all the media and movies and TV shows and ads, and it's just everywhere. It takes a lot of um I don't know what it is, like independence or something to be able to.
Mhm.
Probably one thing that helped me, and I don't know if you're this way, but like I'm a little bit oppositional.
Mhm.
So like I kind of like people tell me go left, I'm like, why? I'm going this other way, or whatever. So I think that helps because I'll kind of like always test what I'm told that I have to believe.
Mhm.
Um, but there's other little personality quirks that might help people get out of this. But
Mhm.
um, that this is a clinical problem. Like this is a psychoanalytic clinical problem. It's what do you do in a society where these really severe defense mechanisms are culturally dominant?
Mhm.
How do we treat society to get out of this so that we can have a more realistic conversation? That's the question. And it's hard to scale individual therapy interventions to society, but there are certain things we can do, like help model how to talk about them and encourage that people do so and things. But
Isn't
it's
it interesting that that's sort of the, I guess, like the mirror image of what is being done through social justice too, is that the addressing of a systemic problem that's society wide, and the thinking that we need to help individuals change in order to change society. I mean, that's the thing that their
right.
whole argument for the inclusion of these ideas in psychotherapy training, counseling training is this idea. And yet when we talk about it, we end up kind of coming back to that same framework. It's so interesting. It feels like almost like you're being forced into this paradigm.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's like I think there's a real risk that people end up becoming exactly what they're supposedly against. I think you see that a lot in individuals. Like just as like an anecdotally, like somebody who's really narcissistic, they really are trying to like be get praise and admiration everywhere. They can really end up setting themselves up to be humiliated a lot.
Mhm.
Narcissists are often more likely to get humiliated,
Mhm.
and it's like there's something about they're trying so hard to be admired and they end up getting shamed. And you see that with lots of other things. Somebody who's like very afraid of abandonment can end up pushing people away. And it's a psychotherapy. It happens enough. You see it enough that you end up doing exactly recreating the exact thing you're trying to avoid.
Mhm.
And I think it's especially likely to happen when like these really extreme defense mechanisms are at play. So much of what they do is the opposite of what the
Mhm.
stated goal. Like there's so much reaction formation. And so I think that's
It
part.
reminds me of the story about splitting that you gave when you were in an inpatient unit and you're watching as this sort of would ripple out, this
Yeah.
sort of process, almost having on a pattern level, a contagion.
Splitting definitely does have this, and we deal with this at the Open Therapy Institute in a really real way because it's like, how do we start to address the problem of bias
Hmm.
in mental health? Because there's, on the one hand, like to say these are all the things that you're getting wrong and you're awful, and to like take that, it's like there's a real easy way that you can just become a mirror image of the activists and lock horns, and they say you're right wing, and you say, oh, well, you're left wing, and you know, the pull to do that is very strong.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's another way of trying to deal with it, which is to say, we're going to be totally unideological and totally neutral. And but that doesn't end up working most of the time because then you can't really address the problems. Like if you actually address the issues, all of a sudden you're in it. You know, you can't kind of stay above the fray and avoid controversy and just say, let's all be neutral. You'll either be ignored or you'll be attacked as racist anyway, but you can't
Mm-hmm.
really address problems. So it's very hard to walk the line between those two things and to say, I'm not going to like get in this unproductive fight with you that goes nowhere, but I am going to like try to constructively talk about problems. And this is exactly the type of thing that we deal with patients who split.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like you don't want to fight with them, but you can't just be nice and hope that the symptoms go away. You have to actually like talk about them and confront them in an assertive way. Um, and it's really hard to avoid getting pulled to one side or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, this is a great elaboration on some of the ideas that you were talking about last time we talked, and taking it a few steps further. And perhaps would you like to save uh,
Yeah.
some
Well,
bullet points for another
I think
discussion, or go longer?
no, I think I can do them pretty quickly,
Okay, okay,
actually.
yeah.
I'll just kind of highlight them. They, excuse me, they do. I think a lot of these are things that we've hit on before, but this is these are six things. There's so many problems with these trainings as they're most commonly talked about, and these six are just one. I mean, Lee Jussum and Pamela Paresky and some other researchers just had a study showing that DEI trainings increase hostile attribution bias, you know, where people in the demonized groups are more likely to be perceived as hostile when they aren't, and it can
Mm-hmm.
aggression towards them.
Mm-hmm.
There's more and more stuff like this as we really start unpacking exactly how dysfunctional they are. I think this first six or seven things are really just the start of what's out there. But I'll just do these really quick. I mean, I think these are things that probably a lot of the audience has thought about. But like
Mm-hmm.
one, obviously, they suppress dialogue. A key issue here is that when anything that's racist or sexist is forbidden from being talked about, it people don't know what those words mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you're left guessing, and it just, why risk it if you're going to get fired for saying something or, you know, face these severe consequences if you break these rules. So just the speech codes and the implicit speech codes really suppress dialogue. If they want to have dialogue in DEI trainings, they actively have to cultivate it by fostering dialectical thinking and modeling that and showing that you don't have to agree with every tenant and inviting disagreement. Of course, they never do that. At least I've never been to one that did that. Another really obvious one is stereotyping, just really overgeneralizing about groups. White people never experience racism. Everyone in every other group does. You know, this is what men are like. This is what women are like. There's so many crude overgeneralizations that for people positively or negatively stereotyped, it can feel like you're boxed into being a victim or an oppressor or this or that. And I think it can be unpleasant for people in both groups. Um, a third issue is this is one that I mentioned in the article, but it's safetyism, and it's this sense that people are overly fragile, that like if you come from you know an area of Southeast Asia where they speak an obscure language, and you come to the West and people mispronounce your names, that's trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like it's just this over and then and innocuous stuff is framed as overly traumatic and hellish and problematizing everything. It actually sensitizes people to these problems more than it protects them. And
Mm-hmm.
it obviously triggers things like hostile attribution bias and aggression and things like that. And the last one I just, which maybe we could talk about more in another issue, but it's this idea, it's the idea of an external locus of control, which is just excuse me, it's just that the outcomes for you are not in your control.
Mm,
That how you're affected and what happens in your life is in the it's run by this system that produces the outputs. It's a racist system that engineers these outputs, and individuals don't have control over their own behavior. When that gets internalized, people are likely to feel hopeless, powerless, depressed, anxious, angry, paranoid. And it actually, that is something that harms people's outcomes, is that they assume that nothing they do matters, and they can actually become more antisocial, more aggressive, more counterproductive, more self-sabotaging. It's really demoralizing for
mm,
people of every group.
mhm,
So just to highlight, like, I think the point of those, like, suppressing dialogue, stereotyping, external locus of control, safetyism, just to hit on the idea that there are lots of really dysfunctional dynamics that we have a really strong reason to think increase mental illness, increase emotional distress, increase interpersonal conflict, increase negative, counterproductive, and dysfunctional behaviors. It's like, and I think we're really just starting. Like, there's so many problems with these.
mhm.
And I think as we really start to unpack them and measure them, we're going to see just like um they're far worse than I think they get credit for. The thing that bothers me more than anything about the critique of DEI is when people say it's a waste of money or it's a waste of time. That's such a pet peeve of mine, because these are so hateful and harmful and false and distorted. And it's like, yeah, they're a waste of money and time, but they're actively harmful and wrong and
Mhm.
destructive.
Yeah,
And
it's like if you had somebody that was being paid to go around and murder every 20th person, and you said, well, you know what's wrong with that? He's getting paid too much. It's a waste of money.
exactly, yeah, exactly. It's like, no, it's like the problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that as people really start looking into more, like, honestly, like, open a psychology textbook and look for dysfunctional dynamics, and, like, you know,
Mhm.
there's a 50-50 chance it's part of DEI trainings. It's just like they're just full of like every mistake in psychology. And it's like it's so sad that our field has failed to apply the principles of our own field
It's
to say
so
it,
shocking that it's taken over psychology. It's so
nobody
shocking
says
to me.
anything. Like, they can't say, like, oh, it's not evidence-based.
These are the
Like,
people who have spent their careers investigating these very issues, and there they are, blind to it and perpetrating it.
or not speaking up out of
Mhm.
for other reasons, but it's like it really destroys the trust in
Mhm.
the entire profession. And
Yeah.
I think that, like, as again, as the splitting dissolves, and I do think that process is starting, but I think it's only starting. There is a lot of repressed content that is yet to come out. Um, but as that happens, I think some of the frustration and disillusionment with leaders in the field is really going to start to shine too. And just a lot of these professions that involve expertise, like, your average person can't go in and read the studies and gather the data and figure out for themselves what's evidence-based. They really function almost entirely on trust. Like, do
Hmm.
you trust them to have done their due diligence or not? It's their entire, like, so when that trust is gone, it's like it doesn't matter if you're right about other issues. People don't trust you anymore.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's really, it's easy to lose trust, and it's hard to get it back.
Hmm. Yeah, very well said. Well, thank you so much for going through all of that. I feel like there's still so much to be said, but that's a good framework. And and thank you for this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Good talking.
You too.